You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is Anna Sherman. Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show lined up for you. Before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. She's got a team of 8 people who help provide services to fiction authors. She has a full slate of services that now include beta reading. She's got 4 beta readers now. So if you're looking for beta reading services, she can definitely take on your project. Manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors can also inquire about putting their books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. It's free to authors for a limited time. Be sure to check out Crystal and her whole team at Pico's House. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Thanks, Crystal, for sponsoring the show. While cape and spandex movies are breaking box office records, comic book commentator and influencer Ed Gosney doesn't want us to forget the roots of these marvelous wonders. His blog, Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com, covers the gamut of 4-color entertainment, from contemporary comic books to comics made for kids to bargain bin gold to classics that will transport you back in time. Comic books are a perfect blend of art and story, and Cool Comics captures the essence of what these funny books mean to us in a personal way. And make sure to join the Cool Comics in My Collection Facebook group, where members can interact, show off their prized comics, and have opportunities to win. You guessed it, Cool Comics. Published weekly, Cool Comics in My Collection aims to bring you a smile and reminds us why comic books are fun. Be sure to visit edgosney.com today. Speaking of superheroes and comics, my friend Patricia Gilliam has a fantastic series called the Heroes of Corvus. It begins with book 1, a flight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. This is such a phenomenal story. She has released up to part 4 now, and I cannot wait for part 5 to come out. If you're looking for a great adventure read that's on the cutting edge of what is in today's entertainment, The Heroes of Corvus is the series for you by Patricia Gilliam. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com to subscribe to the show. We're on just about every platform you can imagine. Now stay tuned for our show. Thank you for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am really excited to have Anna Sherman on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book called The Bells of Old Tokyo, Meditations on Time and a City. And I was just telling Anna before we started recording that this book is fantastic and mesmerizing, and it's rare, one of those books that transports you to another place and another time, and this is one of those books. So welcome to the show, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question. 700 episodes in, and we always start with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I always wrote poetry, so I don't even remember the first poem I wrote. I remember the grown-ups around me laughing a lot when I read my verse to them. But I suppose for writing, like serious writing, I was 10, and I wrote a play called Henry VIII. It was a combination of the 1970s miniseries and the play Blithe Spirit. So the other 10-year-olds performed it, and a local TV station wanted to film it, but my mom said no because she was really worried. She was worried that I'd peak at the age of 10. So, but she did enter it into a competition, and it was rejected with this advice. Write about something closer to home, because as you may or may not know, I'm from Arkansas. So I suppose the judges of the competition thought a 10-year-old writing about Henry VIII was a bit ridiculous. And they didn't see the Tudors as a very successful miniseries coming out in a few decades. And anyway, so this advice, stay closer to home, made my mother furious, but it probably was good advice.
Oh, I just love the idea of peaking at 10 years old. That's
Well, it may have happened. It's just, the thing is, we wouldn't have the evidence on film.
Right. Being from Arkansas, that's a great place to be from. There's a kind of this undercurrent in Southern culture of storytelling. I'm from South Mississippi. There's this interesting thing. Maybe it's because of our hot summers and people sitting on front porches in the evening, and that doesn't happen as much since we have air conditioning now. But but if you watch a movie now, we all just live on the front porch but anyway. Can you look back on your time as a kid in Arkansas, and do you feel those storytelling roots from the culture there?
Well, I have to tell you, my grandfather was from Macomb. So,
okay.
Yeah. Actually, I don't feel like I've ever really left Arkansas. It's and it is really interesting to me, even though I've lived in many different places, like countries, continents, but one thing that really strikes me when I go home is just how green language is there. And I don't know why it is. I feel like there are theories. I mean, I think so much of it may depend on the fact that the book that is really well known there is the King James Bible. So you have this slightly archaic language, poetic language, metaphorical expressions, symbolism, just a kind of the culture comes with that. And I think, I was raised that way. I mean, my family were Methodists, but my grandmother's family were missionary Baptists. And, you were 3 times a week, people were reading to you from the King James Bible. And they're really the kind of the extravagant, the bright chapters, like Revelations, Isaiah, just this really lush language. And so I think I never really left, but you could meet people in the grocery store. And I remember meeting this neighbor of ours who was a veteran of the Korean War, and he was describing taking a bath near the Yalu in January. And he said, I shook myself and water droplets flew off my skin and had frozen before they hit the floor. And like I said, we were standing in the grocery store and I could hear these little crystals falling. And I think at the same time, I very early on was interested in interviewing people. And usually I would sort of pick the strangest, the oldest, somebody whom I knew had interesting experiences. And you just try to interview them about their memories of a point in history, like the Bay of Pigs or Pearl Harbor. And so I would be young, like a young teenager, sort of taking notes on things that my relatives had said. So, and no one really thought that was a strange thing to do. And I think after a while, I stopped asking them about events and then would move towards an abstraction, like what is the saddest thing you remember? What is the most beautiful thing you remember? And I was always intrigued by how different the answers were. So really what I did when I went to Japan was just take that formula, if you can call it a formula, and I just asked various people who lived in Tokyo, various Japanese who would grant me interviews, and asked them what their thoughts about time were and their first memories of understanding that time was a concept. So, like I said, I think I never left Arkansas. I'm still doing the same things.
Love it. I don't know that I've ever directly drawn a line between Southern culture and the King James Bible, and it's just one of those things that is there, and you don't realize that it's there as far as the way it permeates the culture. But that is a fantastic observation.
Well, can I tell you a story, which I think
Yes.
is very interesting, about someone who taught me Shakespeare? I did a lot of summer theater when I was a teenager too, and so I went up to Michigan, and I was I remember the director who taught who oversaw a production of The Tempest was talking about this one brilliant man whom he'd worked with, and who toured with Shakespeare throughout the states. And he got to West Virginia, and he said that the actors were groaning and, oh, we're in West Virginia, what are they going to know? And so it was a production of Macbeth, and they went out, and the actors could immediately tell that the air was electric, that the audience was really with them, and they had never performed so well. And so they went back to the director saying, what happened? Like, what was that about? And the director just laughed at them and said, you fools, don't you understand? Like, the language, it's not been grafted. It hasn't been cut. The boughs are still attached to the tree. And so I'm sorry, I haven't told the story well, but the way the director told it, he had the accents of the kind of haughty actors and the credulous, just coming. But I think that that's true as well. It's like people, King James Bible and Shakespeare, that's the same era. And, really quite interesting things were happening in English then. And I think that in parts of the South, it's just, because of the way it was settled, people still have that connection, to language. And, ideas are not separate from us. And what we perhaps always do with that, lack of separation isn't always wise or great, because we're human. But I'm not trying to make Southerners out to be some mystical tribe, but I just think that that actually maybe there is a practical reason for it. And like I said, you can go to the grocery store and have the most transforming conversation, in front of the TV dinners.
Well, and we've never met a metaphor or a simile that we didn't love.
So true.
So true. Yeah. So you mentioned your time in Japan. What led you from Arkansas to Japan?
Oh, I'm tumbleweed. Well, I was working in London as an editor for the Financial Times, and
what
my
brought
husband
you to London?
Oh, well, a boy. It's I fell in love, and he was English, and we got married. And so he had a job opportunity in Tokyo, and because being an editor is a kind of simple thing to do in the sense of, you can travel, you can work from your desk. So he wanted to go, and we went. He was we didn't have children or a mortgage, and we wanted an adventure. Yeah, the Japanese always blinked at us when we would say that. What do you want? I'm here for an adventure. I think they were never sure if that was a compliment or not. I mean, perhaps correctly so. I mean, just because it's not an it's an ambivalent answer, isn't it? But doesn't everyone want that?
Right, but it kind of brings the connotation like, are you expecting my place to be an adventure? Are you expecting me to be an adventure?
Exactly.
What are you looking for, lady?
But I was brightly telling them this, and without, I was very proud of myself for knowing the Japanese word for adventure. And like I said, I think they were,
that's amazing.
Wary. They were wary. But when I gave interviews, again, because I was not polished. My Japanese, at its height was never perfect. And so I think that perhaps that made them let their guard down, like the people whom I was interviewing, and also I think the question of time intrigued them too. It's because no one can really define it. Not the scientists, not the artists, not the writers. It's just something we all think about, but no one can really define. So
before we dig into that, you being from Arkansas and your husband being from England, and you go on this adventure together. Because you two came from similar yet very dissimilar cultures yourself. Of course, we all speak English, and America and Britain have this very special relationship, and we always have. But did the two of you have the same ideas of adventure when you decided to go to Japan? Do you feel like you got each other, or was this something that your relationship grew as you did it?
It was hard. A lot of people split up when they go abroad, and I think that we perhaps as a couple were always slightly strange. I mean, when we met, I was studying Greek and Latin, which I had first learned in Arkansas, because I think that they were still teaching a kind of 19th century curriculum there in the best sense. Like, it was, you were expected to kind of be a Renaissance person. So, my public high school had Greek and Latin. And my husband was a natural scientist. And so I think that was as much of a gulf as anything. It's just because the way he approaches problems is different, or the way he tells a story or sees a situation, a character is different than mine. So I think that was tricky. But living in a different country was difficult, but at the same time, for me as a writer, I had worked, and loved being an editor, because I felt like that was quite like carpentry, and I felt like I was actually a good craftsperson. It's just, you learn how to listen to the person whom you're working for, and you cut the wood according to what it is. So you do a different thing with oak than with pine or walnut, and but I felt very held constrained as a writer, because again, you grow up, especially I can say growing up in the shadow of Faulkner in the South was just, could be crushing, just because you thought, well, how can I do anything that is as interesting, as brilliant, as visionary and strange as Absalom, or Good on Moses? Like, what can I contribute? And I think that the easy answer was nothing. So you kind of just don't feel like you can compete. And again, it just, maybe that seems a ridiculous thing to do, because he's writing about he's writing about historical memory of the late 19th century. He's writing about, his own experiences in the teens and the 20s. But at the same time, you have this huge sort of burden of influence. And then I went to Japan, and suddenly I was illiterate. I couldn't speak. You had to look at the world from fresh eyes. And as I began to learn the language, one of the things that really impressed me was, this is a generalization, but everyone in Japan writes, little phrases. I mean, maybe not everyone, but it's just something, it's part of being human. It's kind of expected. Like, you go into a stationery shop, and there are these little scrolls that you can mount yourself with sayings that you like, perfect little postcards that you're meant to dash off to your friends. And not everyone lives like this, of course. The Japanese love their iPhones as much as we do. But I'm saying it took away the expectation that, I would have to, write poetry that was as fine as T.S. Eliot's, or, be from the South and not Faulkner. So it was really liberating. And so I think that made me perhaps happier to be what is, to use an ugly phrase, a trailing spouse, than I would have been if we'd gone someplace where I felt like I couldn't grow as a person and as a writer.
Well, speaking of this topic of time, it's such a fascinating thing, because it's something we all inhabit. It's something that we are aware of by our surroundings, yet is such a nebulous concept to actually put your finger on. I'm from Mississippi, and we now live back in Mississippi. But for a time, we kind of traveled the world, lived in different places, and we lived in Colorado for a couple of years.
Wow! And
what really fascinated me about Colorado is no one was from there. And yeah, you very rarely met a Colorado native, and we lived in Colorado Springs, which has 4 military bases. Wow. And nothing has a sense of age about it. Right. The oldest things you see around are 70, 80 years. Right. Maybe, and being from a place where, and Mississippi is definitely not the oldest, of the American, states, territories, colonies, but, down in Biloxi on on the actual coast that we have a 400-year-old lighthouse, and we can trace back to several hundreds of years, and I know places in New England go farther. But there's a sense of history. We trace our family roots back. We want to feel connected to that. But the most we can go back is four something hundred years in this place. England has a richer, longer history. But then, at most you're talking 1,500, 2,000 years if you're being really generous. In a place like Japan, we're talking about serious history there. What was the fascination with time, and why was this so important for you to dig into in a place like Japan?
Well, let me clarify.
Okay.
I only tried to write about Tokyo, and I think that for the reasons you've just set out, if I had tried to write about Nara or Kyoto or Fukuoka, like Dazaifu, I would have really struggled just because there's so much there. But Tokyo really, as a city, as a cosmopolitan city, goes back only about 400 years. But back to your question about, is time nebulous, or how do you treat that? I would say we have more in common, or with Tokyo, than perhaps you might expect, because it has been, just so many disasters, like fires, earthquakes, floods. It was very, very vulnerable, and they always were starting over, and again, you're looking at 400 years. But what interested me about it was just the really rich language that they had, many, many different words for time. And I just thought, why is that when English and most of the other Indo-European languages have so few, really just a handful. So I found that was just because of the way that they borrowed literature, philosophy, religion from China and India. So in a sense, they were able to take from other cultures, which, as you say, were really ancient, like the Chinese. Like that would have been a much more difficult book to write. If I had to go deeper and longer than 400 years. But I felt like 400 years was manageable.
Yeah. Well, as you started talking to people, and when did this realization about the depth of time come about? Was it when did you start realizing that this had so many different words and that it was such an interesting concept?
I flipped open their a thesaurus, an old thesaurus, and I looked into it and was just like, whoa, because there were so many different words there. I've never sat down and actually counted them all, but at least, I want to say at least 50, does that sound right? I mean, for different things, but again, I just was amazed, and I thought, how can this be? Like, what are they doing? Like, what are they communicating? And it was just more a precise language, but again, which reflects their borrowing from China, classical Chinese poetry. And the Chinese had something called a zodiac, which it's not related to the actual stars in the sky. It's a very mysterious, ancient way of describing the hours and the years. So how if perhaps if you have a Chinese national and they talk about being born in the year of the monkey or the year of the boar, that kind of says who you are. So the Japanese inherited all of that too. It really is very complicated, and the people whom I spoke to would be confused about it as well, and the scientists would quote classical poetry, and the artists and the poets would cite equations. For everyone, it was just something other, something remote. But the points when I felt the stories were very moving is when they talked about remembering being a very young child, and some of their earliest memories would be like when you realized that time was real. So
when you started interviewing people, what were some things that that surprised you, and maybe about how different this culture was and their concept of time and things we take for granted, or maybe what assured you that we're not that different? It's just a different expression.
I came to feel like I didn't feel a sense of division at all. I felt actually, and my favorite answer was given to me by this very young priest, and he looked so young, like a flower pressed between the pages of the book. He was just so thin, because I met a lot of people who were, I mean, I don't know, like maybe it was the robes he was wearing, which were this very fine black gauze silk. And he said to me, well, time is simple. I close my eyes and everything ends, and I open them and everything is reborn again. And I thought that's such a lovely idea. It's just that somehow the clocks stop when we go to sleep and they start again when we wake up, which it sounds very whimsical. But, he was, that was how he saw it. And I just thought it was so elegant as a way to describe it, how he felt. So, but I don't think it is a question you can ever get to the bottom of. It's kind of interesting framework for considering our time on our lives on Earth. And actually, one of their great philosophers said that is that when you think about it, it doesn't matter, who lives a long time, who lives a short time. It's just the framework in which we experience, childhood, adulthood, and old age.
At what point in your adventure did this start looking like a book to you?
It was a bit being pregnant. When you're not sure if the baby is gonna, if you're gonna, there's no one likes to tell anyone about a baby before the first 3 months. And so I just waited, and then I thought after a while you start showing, and you can't deny that. That you're going to have a baby. And I think was very cagey in the beginning about saying that I was working on a book, because it felt very private. And also I think I was expecting to be mocked, because most people whom I knew in the expatriate community would say, well, why aren't you writing a blog? Or, I mean, that was the kind of fashionable thing when I started 10 years ago. It's like, why don't you just write a blog? The Japanese thought I was crazy just because it was such a difficult, first of all, writing about Tokyo, which is huge. And then secondly, just again, how do you define time? I just thought it was a beautiful concept, but they just were like, this is nuts. But I started being able to see it as if it were a crystal, and I could just, it's something your hairline polishing, and it just, I don't know, came into shape, and I just cut it until it was right. It was the right, dimensions, the right brilliancy. I don't know how to describe it, but like that.
Well, the book is, I told you, it's one of the most, I struggle to even find a word for it. It's odd in a beautiful way. And I don't mean odd as in strange. I mean odd as in, it's one of those things that's hard to put your finger on. Like exactly what is this book? It's part memoir. It's your experiences. It's part travel log. But you also dig into these rich histories and these stories. Where did you uncover the stories that you're sharing about the people and places?
Do you have a specific?
No, I guess I just mean like the
genre
yeah,
it's in, or
yeah.
Okay. So many people have asked me this, and I find it really surprising, because Peter Matheson, who wrote The Snow Leopard and whose work I revere, I just felt like I was following in I was following the road that he laid down, but I guess he was writing in the early 70s. So it's not straight reporting. It's not fiction, because I wanted to be really careful and absolutely not make anything up. So, but at the same time, like I wanted the book to be light, like a paper airplane almost. So just so much research went into that book, just people whom I spoke to, books that I read. But I wanted a kind of lightness. I wanted the reader to not feel weighed down by research. So the notes, which are at the end, are optional, but they are there because a quite famous publisher promised me that he would take the book and then changed his mind because his second reader said, well, no, it worked out. It was almost like a fairy tale. But the second reader said she cannot have done this research. And so I put the notes together somewhat obsessively,
well,
proving him wrong.
Let me tell
but
the
for
listeners,
whatever reason, people read it.
The notes
and they
are
say,
serious.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to tell the listeners the notes are serious. That when she says a note section, she means a note section. There's lots.
But I hope they're like a treasure map
absolutely.
for people who want to find, where I got things. Because for people who want to read about the firebombs or fascist architecture or where the river flowed, it's hard. It's not just hard. None of those sources existed in one place. So what I hope is that if anything I've said in the book interests the reader, they'll know where the ideas came from. But I did have readers from Picador, actually, when they passed the manuscript around the house, and they thought it was a work of fiction, I guess, because of that lightness that I was saying to you. But Tom Stoppard once said that research should be like a train passing through a landscape. It shouldn't leave a trace. And I really took that to heart because I wanted everything to be factually correct and right. But at the same time, like I said, I didn't want it to be one of those things where people feel like they're wading through wet concrete or something, So like if people, and it was also kind of the book I wish that I'd had in 2001 when I first went to Japan, because you have so many questions about the city, like you don't understand why things are the way they are. And I guess this book was an answer to the questions I had.
Love it.
When I went there.
Your love of poetry really shines through in this book, not only in actual poetry that's included in the book, but your kind of lyrical style of writing. And at times, I understand what you mean by the lightness of the book. And when people get their copy and read it, they'll understand too. There's almost a dreamy quality to some of the scenes. And I mean that with the utmost respect. Like it's such an interesting style that you write in. Is that something that you're conscious of when you're writing, or is that just what comes out?
I think, we go back to Arkansas and we grew up in a very oral culture. So, I felt like it should be read aloud, actually. Like I read the passages often aloud. I'm really flattered that you should say that, though. Thank you. Conscious. I think also my years as an editor, because I pared away. And after that, the story of the book's publication was almost like a fairy tale and I feel like I shouldn't say who offered for the book and then kind of changed his mind. But and it was devastating and I waited for months, just because I didn't understand what had happened. I didn't understand. I still don't know who the second reader was, but I had worked in journalism and really had very strong, passionate feelings about not making things up in this kind of book, not least because I always wanted it to be translated into Japanese, and I always wanted the people who really honored me with their time and their thoughts about things that were quite private. Because as you know, there are descriptions of, surviving the firebombs. There are descriptions of, there's the person whose family as shoguns lost everything they had. I wanted them to feel like I had honored, their own words and didn't twist them or overwrite them. So, like I said, it was devastating to be accused of not being honest. So I don't know, but I think as an editor, so I kept paring away until basically what you have. But I think that some of that was, in fact, just not cutting away everything that wasn't the book.
That I was going to ask you how your editor brain worked but I think you've answered that wonderfully. You said that when you moved to Tokyo in 2001, how long did you work on this book before bringing it to market?
Well, I worked, it was 10 years. It took 10 years. I know who's counting, but it was very funny because I had a friend there whom I would just sometimes, go out for drinks with, and he was a literary agent, which I hadn't really clocked. I mean, we would talk about literature, we talk about Japan a lot, and interestingly, so I sent him the manuscript, and he arranged for my current editor, who's Ravi Merchandani, to look at it. And Ravi took a year, and then after a year, he picked it up and read it, and then said, I'm actually enjoying this. And so then he offered for it, but it was turned down a lot by most of the big names who, some of them said we're publishing books on Japan by more famous people. Other ones said, this is too strange. We don't know what it is. It won't sell. So, there were lots of indignities on the road to this book being accepted.
Well, thank God that it showed up in the form that it did, and I absolutely love it. Anna, if people are just learning about you and want to find out more and follow along for news and stuff like that, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yes, I'm at Anna_Charlbury, CHARLBURY on Twitter.
Great. I'm going to send everyone to pick up their copy of The Bells of Old Tokyo. I absolutely love this book, and I love what you're doing. Are you working on anything now?
I am actually about your part of the world, because I really wanted to take the concept of geography and an abstraction and basically look at Arkansas. So, or rather, South Arkansas and Northern Louisiana. So you will, I've even ventured a bit into Mississippi.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, that one hopefully won't take 10 years.
I love it. I can't wait to see what you come up with. Anna, we're going to send everyone to see you and to pick up their copy of The Bells of Old Tokyo. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. Be sure to subscribe at hankgarner.com or on your favorite podcasting app. Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
They reverently slipped Jason's giant-size X-Men #1 from its mylar protector, drinking in the sweet aroma of browning paper and three-color process that signals only the best and rarest and most wonderful of collectibles. On one page, Professor X raised his fingers to his temples and rallied his X-Men, his psychic commands radiating from his bald head like waves off hot asphalt. "I have psychic powers," Owen blurted. "I want Wolverine's claws." Jason was turning a page. "Snicked. Or, hey, get this. Lightsabers poking out the backs of my hands. Or even, no, I'm totally serious. I have psychic powers." "No, you don't." "I do." Jason laid the comic on the bedspread. He sighed. Owen could be such a spaz sometimes. "Okay," he said indulgently. "What number am I thinking of?" "Stop, it doesn't work that way. What I can do is called a psychic reading, off an object, like getting impressions. When the doorbell rings, if I put my hand on the knob, as soon as I do, I know who's there." "It's called looking through the peephole, moron." "Shut up! And when I touch the phone, I know who's calling." "I'm sure, Mr. Bullshit from Bullshit Mountain. Like my sister or my grandmother, I just know it's them." "There's no such thing as psychics." "Okay, you try." "Don't be stupid. Are you chicken?" "Fine." "Okay." He snatched up a brown paper bag, spotted with grease, and dumped a few stale French fries into the trash can. "I'll put an object in this bag, and you try to guess what it is. Turn your back." Jason did, and heard a rustling behind his head. "Okay, you can look now." Owen produced the bag. It was rounded with some object now. "Don't touch yet, just think. Try to imagine what's inside." "Your lunch?" Jason sneered, but he closed his eyes and tried to imagine. He could hear Owen's breathing. Jason's nose itched. His brain grew bored with nothing to look at, and fragments of images swam in and out of his imagination. "Strawberry," he blurted. Owen reached into the bag, producing a white bowl. Jason had eaten Frosted Flakes from it about 3 days ago. A few stuck to it, like little beige fish scales. "See? I lose." "No, look here." Owen pointed. A design went around the sides of the bowl. A long string of vines and painted fruit. With strawberries. "That's," Jason began, but didn't know how to end the sentence. "It's cool. See? What did I tell you? Do it again." Jason closed his eyes. An image like daisies and sun and yellow, he blurted after 3 seconds. "Oh my God, open your eyes!" Owen held a bright yellow highlighter pen. "I hadn't even put it in the bag." And so they went, for 30 minutes or more. A staple remover, a toy soldier, a sweat sock, a pencil. Jason never said precisely what was in the bag, but it was always close or related. He'd imagine a cockpit, and Owen would produce a game controller. He'd say plate, and the object would be a CD. He made right angles with his pointer fingers, shrugging, only to have Owen pull out Eliza's knitting needles. His friend became more and more enthusiastic, but Jason became a little scared. "You have a real gift," Owen said. "You're brilliant." Owen babbled for a long time about astral projection and ESP, how Jason was picking up signals from Owen's own psychic powers, which had obviously been doing the broadcasting. Owen left that night full of plans and experiments, vindicated in his beliefs. Jason sat on the bed after Owen left, thinking hard. He had no explanation for what he'd done, but he knew he hadn't faked it. He couldn't believe, but he couldn't deny either.